My name is Tessa Rayner, and when I was 17, I believed in forever. Back then, forever looked like a boy with grass-stained cleats and a crooked smile, waiting for me by the lockers with his hoodie half-zipped and a bag of sour candy in his hand. Before we dive in, if you've ever loved someone so fiercely it changed the course of your life, go ahead and subscribe, or share this story. You're not alone, and maybe hearing mine will bring a little comfort to yours. So, back to Caleb Jackson. He was Eagle Bend High's golden boy, the star forward on our soccer team with shaggy blonde hair that never quite behaved and this laugh that made teachers forget they were mad at him. But he wasn't just charming. Not to me. To me, Caleb saw things no one else did, like the way I'd sketch tiny houses on the corner of my notebook instead of taking notes in math, or how I always ordered hot chocolate even in May because it reminded me of my grandma's kitchen. He didn't mock it. He leaned in, listened, remembered. We met sophomore year in Mr. Dorsey's biology class. He forgot his lab partner's name. I corrected him under my breath, and he smirked at me like we had some kind of inside joke. By homecoming, we were inseparable. By junior year, we were making late-night runs to the 7-Eleven, talking about escaping Eagle Bend, renting a shoebox apartment somewhere near the coast, maybe starting a coffee shop or a bookstore together. "I don't care if we live off boxed mac and cheese forever," he told me once, lying on his back on my Grandma Rose's porch swing. "As long as we're doing it together." I remember blinking up at the stars and thinking, this must be it. The kind of love that sticks. The first time he kissed me, we were at the fall carnival. He'd just won me a stuffed blue raccoon at the bottle ring toss, and I teased him about his aim. He rolled his eyes, leaned in, and everything just stilled. The music, the crowd, even the October breeze, it all faded behind the weight of that kiss. It was sweet, a little unsure, but it anchored something inside me I didn't even know was drifting. Caleb wasn't perfect. He could be impulsive, a little too cocky when he scored a goal, and his texts sometimes dried up when he got stressed about finals. But he always circled back, always found his way to me. We talked about the future like it was something we could shape with our bare hands. So certain, so ours. We'd sketch floor plans on napkins at the diner, argue over whether to adopt a cat or a dog first, and daydream about opening a small business called Ray and Jack's, a mashup of our last names. Looking back, I think part of me knew the clock was ticking, not because of anything he said, but because of how tightly I held on. Like if I gripped too loose, he might just slip away. But at 17, you don't think about endings. You only think about beginnings. And mine? Mine began with Caleb's laugh, the scent of popcorn on his hoodie, and a promise whispered beneath Minnesota stars. And that's the thing about first love. You never expect it to be the thing that breaks you. They don't tell you how quietly a love can end. Not with a scream, not with a slammed door. Sometimes it ends with silence, the kind that lingers on the other end of the phone, stretching between texts that never come. By the end of that summer, Caleb felt like sand slipping through my fingers, still there, but impossible to hold. It started subtly. The late-night calls turned into quick replies. The walks we used to take around Maple Street slowed to once a week, then maybe. He stopped asking about my sketchbook, stopped remembering my shifts at the diner. Instead, he talked about SAT scores and his shot at Stanford, like I was part of a life he was trying to outgrow. And still, I clung to hope. I told myself he was just stressed, that college apps were heavy, that once fall came and things settled, so would we. But I knew better. God, I knew. It all came crashing down one crisp October afternoon. We were walking through Willow Park, leaves crunching under our boots, the whole place burning gold and rust. I reached for his hand, like muscle memory, and he didn't take it. Just kept his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, staring ahead like I wasn't even there. "Caleb?" I said, slowing to match his steps. "You good?" He stopped cold. Right there, under that massive oak where we carved our initials the summer before. "We need to talk," he said. My stomach dropped. Those 4 words are never followed by anything good. "What's going on?" I asked, brushing a windblown strand of hair from my face, trying to meet his eyes. But he looked at the ground instead, kicked at a loose stone like it had more answers than I did. "It's just, this isn't working anymore," he muttered. "Us?" I blinked. "Wait, what?" He sighed, eyes still down. "I've got goals, Tess. Real ones. Stanford, law school, internships. I can't afford distractions. And this?" He motioned vaguely between us. "It's a distraction." A distraction. That word hit harder than I expected, like I was some loud commercial in the background of his ambitions. "I thought we were building something," I whispered. "You said we'd figure it out together." "I know what I said." He finally looked at me, eyes flat. "But I changed my mind." That was it. No apology. No real explanation. Just changed. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to make him remember every late night, every plan scribbled on diner napkins, every promise he swore in the dark. But all I could do was nod, like a fool. He turned and walked away. Didn't glance back once. The leaves swirled in the wind behind him, like the world was shifting without permission. My hands were fists in my jacket sleeves, my chest hollow, aching with everything unsaid. I stood there long after he vanished, not crying, not yet, just frozen in the wreckage of something I thought was unbreakable. There's a certain kind of silence that settles in your chest when you know your life's about to change, but you're still clinging to the possibility that you're wrong. It started with a smell. Coffee. One morning, I was walking past the kitchen and the scent hit me like a punch. My stomach flipped, and I barely made it to the sink before gagging. My mom, Lorraine, joked from behind the paper, "Geez, Tessa, that dramatic over my French roast?" I laughed it off, but deep down, something old and cold tightened inside me. The next few days, I started keeping track. Nausea, dizziness, a weird aversion to mint gum, then the missed period. Just one at first, then two. I bought the test on a rainy Thursday afternoon from the Rite Aid on Pine Street. Hoodie up, head down. I grabbed it with shaking hands and paid in cash. The cashier barely looked at me, which I was thankful for. At home, I locked myself in the upstairs bathroom, the one with the chipped pink tile and flickering light. I set the test on this counter like it might explode. 3 minutes never felt so long. I sat on the edge of the tub, clutching the instructions like they were holy scripture. I remember whispering to myself, "Please, no. Please, God, no." But when the timer buzzed, I looked, and there it was. 2 pink lines, no gray area, no faint maybe, just yes. I couldn't breathe. My hands were shaking. My throat closed. For a second, I thought I might throw up again, but there was nothing left. I stuffed the test into my hoodie pocket and stumbled downstairs. My mom was setting the table. Meatloaf night. Dad was reading the paper at the head of the table like he always did, glasses slipping down his nose. Everything looked painfully normal. "Tessa, dinner's hot," my mom chirped, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Don't let it get cold." I stopped beside the dining room chair, heart pounding like a war drum. My mouth was dry. My voice, when it finally came, sounded like it belonged to someone else. "Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something." My dad folded his paper slowly, his brow furrowed. "You okay, honey?" I looked at both of them, and then I said it. "I'm pregnant." The word landed like a rock through glass. My mom's serving spoon slipped from her hand and hit the tablecloth, splattering gravy. My dad's face darkened so fast it scared me. "Pregnant?" my mom gasped. "Tessa Marie Rayner, are you out of your mind?" I opened my mouth to explain, to plead, but my father slammed his fist on the table. "Who?" he barked. "That Caleb boy?" My voice cracked. "He's gone, Dad, but I'll figure this out." Silence. Then my mother. "You've ruined everything." There's a sound I'll never forget. The crack of my father's fist slamming into the dining table, loud enough to make my mother flinch and the silverware jump. After I told them I was pregnant, the air changed. Like someone opened all the windows in the dead of winter. Dad stood slowly, eyes dark, jaw tight. "You've got to be kidding me," he said, voice cold and sharp. "It wasn't supposed to happen," I whispered, "but I'm not running from it." My mom turned away from the gravy-splattered tablecloth and stared at me, her hands trembling. "Do you even realize what you've done? What people will say? The church board? The neighbors?" "I don't care about them," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is my life. I'm keeping the baby." My dad's laugh was bitter, short. "Not under this roof, you're not." I blinked. "What?" "You heard me," he snapped. "You made this bed, Tessa. Go lie in it somewhere else." "Stephen," my mom started, her voice cracking. "Don't—" "Don't what, Lorraine?" He turned on her. "Let her stay here so she can throw the rest of her life away in front of us?" "She's 17, she said weakly, but even she couldn't look me in the eye. I wanted to believe this was just rage talking, that if I gave them time, they'd come around. But then my dad looked at me with something worse than anger, disappointment. "I won't let you shame this family," he said. "Pack your things. Tonight." I stood frozen, my hand still on the back of my dining chair, the last place I'd ever been someone's daughter. My legs didn't carry me up the stairs so much as dragged me. I pulled out the old duffel bag from under my bed, the one I used for soccer camp. I stuffed it with sweaters, jeans, socks, and my sketchbook. My hands moved on instinct, but my mind was somewhere else entirely, caught in a slow-motion freefall. Every creak of the floorboard beneath my feet felt louder than it ever had. Every poster on my wall, every glow-in-the-dark star on the ceiling, it all stared back like a goodbye. I paused, breathless, before zipping the bag shut. Then I reached for the photo on my desk, me and Caleb at the county fair last summer, him holding a plastic bear and me laughing like nothing could ever touch us. My fingers hovered. I didn't smash it, didn't throw it across the room. I tucked it in the side pocket. Let it be a reminder, I thought bitterly, of how fast someone can leave when life stops being easy. Downstairs, the lights still glowed. My mom stood at the sink, dabbing at her eyes with a dish towel. She didn't turn when I said, "I'm leaving." She only whispered, "Where will you even go?" I didn't answer, because the truth was, I had no idea. There's something unreal about snow falling under streetlights, like the world's trying to make something ugly feel soft. It was just past 10 p.m. when I walked out the front door, my duffel bag heavy on my shoulder, breath fogging in the cold January air. The porch light behind me cast a warm glow I refused to look back at. I knew if I did, I'd break. And I couldn't afford that. Not now. The sidewalk crunched beneath my sneakers, wet slush soaking through the soles within minutes. I hadn't even thought about boots. I was still in the same hoodie I'd worn that morning, back when I still thought I had a home. I reached the bus stop at the end of our street. Nothing but a wooden bench, half buried in snow, no schedule posted, no shelter, just silence. And that's when the panic really hit. Where am I going? I sat down hard, hugging my bag to my chest, trying not to cry, but the tears burned anyway, freezing on my cheeks as fast as they fell. I pulled out my phone with numb fingers, scrolling through my contacts. Not Caleb, not my parents, not anyone from school. Then I saw it. Grandma Rose, my dad's mom, the only person who'd ever really seen me. I hadn't talked to her since Christmas, and even then it was brief, 10 minutes of small talk and a slice of store-bought pie. But I remembered what she'd said when she hugged me at the door. "You're always welcome at my place, kid, no matter what." I tapped her name and held the phone to my ear, heart thudding. 1 ring, 2, 3. Then, "Tessa?" Her voice was scratchy, warm, laced with confusion. "Sweetheart, it's late. You okay?" I burst into tears. "Grandma, I don't have anywhere to go. They kicked me out. I didn't know who else to call. Can I come stay with you?" There was a rustle on the other end, maybe her shifting in that creaky old recliner she always read in. Then came her reply, steady, no hesitation. "Of course you can. You get here safe, you hear? I'll put the porch light on and the kettle up." My breath caught on a sob. "Thank you. I'll be waiting, honey, always." I hung up, clutching the phone like it was oxygen. For the first time all night, I felt something besides fear. I felt held, even if only by a voice on the line and a promise from an old woman 2 hours away in Redwood. Some homes don't announce themselves with sighs or shine. Some just glow, quietly, like a porch light left on in the dark. The Greyhound pulled into Redwood just after 12:30 a.m. The parking lot was silent except for the hum of the engine and the crunch of frost under my sneakers. My bag, heavier now from the hours and everything I'd left behind, thudded against my leg with every step. And then I saw it, her house. Small, red brick. The porch sagged slightly to the left, and a trail of winter roses poked bravely through the snow along the fence line. But the light above the door? It glowed like it had been waiting for me. Before I could even knock, the door creaked open. There she was. Grandma Rose. Hair pulled into a messy gray bun, wrapped in a quilted robe, slippers soft on the wood floor. "Tessa," she breathed, her eyes scanning every inch of me. The dark circles, the red nose, the way my shoulders curled inward like I'd been trying to disappear. "Come here." I dropped the bag, and she pulled me into a hug. Tight, no hesitation. Her arms didn't feel fragile. They felt like shelter. She didn't ask questions. She just said, "Let's get you warm." The house smelled the same as it had when I was little. Chamomile tea, old books, and something sweet, like cinnamon tucked into the walls. I followed her into the tiny kitchen, and she moved slowly but deliberately, fixing 2 mugs of tea and pulling out a plate of leftover grilled cheese sandwiches like it was a holiday. We sat at the small table near the window. Frost had kissed the glass. The radiator hissed in the background. I took 1 sip of the tea, and my eyes filled instantly. "I messed everything up," I whispered, setting the mug down before it spilled. "Mom and Dad, they said I was a disgrace. Dad didn't even hesitate. He just told me to get out." Rose didn't flinch. She reached over, her hand landing solidly on mine. "They said cruel things," she said softly. "But that doesn't make them right. A child isn't a disgrace, Tessa, ever, especially not when they're wanted." I wiped at my eyes with my sleeve. "I'm scared, Grandma. I don't know what I'm doing. Caleb's gone and I'm 17. What if I can't? What if I mess this baby up?" She looked me dead in the eye. "Then we'll figure it out. Together." And for the first time in weeks, something in my chest unclenched. I was still terrified, still angry, still lost. But I wasn't alone anymore. The thing no one tells you about breaking down is that sometimes it happens quietly. Not in the screaming, throwing stuff kind of way, but in a whisper, over a cup of tea, in the middle of the night. It was nearly 2 a.m. by the time I'd taken a hot shower, changed into one of Grandma Rose's oversized flannel nightgowns, and curled up on the couch under a crocheted quilt that smelled faintly of lavender and old cedar. The tea sat half-finished on the side table. My duffel bag lay crumpled near the door like it had given up too. Rose moved slowly, easing into her favorite armchair with that familiar groan of springs. Her hands, lined and strong, wrapped around her mug like it held all the warmth left in the world. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then it slipped out of me, raw and cracked. "I'm pregnant." She didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't ask if I was sure. "I figured," she said softly. "The way you were holding your stomach when you walked in, a woman knows." I stared at the tea leaves in my mug, suddenly embarrassed. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Very few things ever are. My throat tightened. Mom said I ruined everything, that I was reckless. Dad wouldn't even look at me, just told me to pack a bag. Rose's jaw clenched, but her voice stayed calm. That wasn't love talking. That was fear. People get loud when they're scared. Well, I'm scared too, I admitted, but I didn't yell. I didn't throw anyone out. My voice cracked on that last word, and suddenly I couldn't hold it in anymore. The tears came fast and hot, blurring everything. I buried my face in my hands. Rose leaned forward, placing her hand gently over mine. "Tessa, look at me." I did. Barely. She said, "A baby is not the end of your life. It's the beginning of a different one. Harder, yes, but not ruined. I don't know how to be someone's mom, I whispered. I don't even know who I am anymore. Well, she said, squeezing my hand, you'll find out, day by day, and you won't be doing it alone. That's when something inside me shifted. Not a full repair, but a crack letting light in. You really mean that? I asked. She nodded. I raised your dad mostly on my own. I can do it again. With you. I let out a shaky laugh. Hope this kid likes chamomile tea and thrift store quilts. She smiled, eyes soft but fierce. This kid's already luckier than most. They've got a mom who didn't run, and a grandma who sure as hell won't. And right then, under a squeaky ceiling fan and the smell of old cookies, we made our first promise. One neither of us said out loud, but both of us felt. We'd face it together. There are moments in life that split you clean down the middle, before and after. It was a Tuesday morning in mid-August, the kind where the air hangs heavy with heat even before the sun climbs past the trees. Grandma Rose had the radio humming softly in the background, and I was rinsing a plate at the sink when the cramp hit, sharp, low, and no longer ignorable. I froze, gripping the counter. "Grandma!" I called, voice shaking. I think it's time." She didn't panic. She tossed aside the dish towel, grabbed her car keys and her purse, and was at my side in seconds. At the hospital. St. Mercy Medical Center. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like they had no idea a universe was about to be born. The contractions came fast, fierce, like waves crashing against a cliff, determined to break it. I squeezed Rose's hand so hard I think I cut off her circulation. She never flinched. "You're doing just fine, honey," she whispered, brushing damp hair from my forehead. "He's almost here." Hours blurred into minutes, or maybe the other way around. Pain twisted through me, primal and unrelenting. There were monitors beeping, nurses moving like shadows, voices muffled like I was underwater. Then, one final push. A sound tore from my throat I didn't know I had, and then, silence, just for a heartbeat. Then it came, his cry, loud, raw, beautiful. My chest cracked wide open. They laid him on my chest, tiny, warm, slick with newness and life. A shock of dark hair curled on his head, his fingers clenched like he already knew how to hold on. I stared at him through tears I didn't even feel falling. My whole body shook, but my arms didn't falter. "You're real," I whispered, tracing the curve of his ear. "You're here." He whimpered again, softer this time, and burrowed against me like he already knew I was his home. Grandma leaned over, her eyes glassy, a grin spreading slow across her face. "Look at that. A fighter." "Just like his mama." I looked at her, breathless. "He's perfect." She nodded. "Yes, he is. And so are you." And just like that, the fear didn't vanish, but it quieted. It stepped aside for something bigger. I didn't know how I'd raise him. I didn't know what tomorrow would look like. But right then, I had him, and he had me. That was enough. "You're my joy," I whispered into his tiny ear. "My secret." And I knew that from this day forward, every decision I made would begin with his heartbeat. There's a quiet kind of magic in the everyday, if you're paying attention. Miles Everett Rayner came into this world with a cry that shook something loose in me, and then, for months, he barely stopped crying. Colic, they said. Or maybe he just missed the sound of my heartbeat too much. Either way, I learned fast that motherhood isn't all lullabies and baby lotion. Sometimes it's pacing the hallway at 3 a.m. with a screaming newborn while your arms go numb and your sanity frays like the hem of an old t-shirt. But still, I loved him more fiercely with each sleepless night. We settled into Grandma Rose's little brick house like it had always been ours. She converted the tiny laundry room into a nursery, lining it with second-hand books and a mobile made of paper stars she cut herself. She'd shuffle into the kitchen at sunrise in her slippers, muttering about the price of formula, and then slide me a plate of toast before I could even ask. "You've got to eat if you're gonna feed him," she'd say, pushing a glass of orange juice into my hand like it was gospel. When Miles started crawling, he did it with the determination of someone twice his size. Chubby knees bruised from trying to conquer the living room rug. When he started babbling, His favorite sound was ba, which he assigned to everything from me to Grandma to the ceiling fan. We laughed more than we cried. That felt like victory. I remember one winter night, the snow falling thick outside, Miles asleep in his crib, and me standing at the kitchen sink washing bottles. I caught a glimpse of myself in the window, hair in a messy bun, oversized sweatshirt, eyes tired but peaceful. It hit me all at once. I wasn't just surviving, I was changing. Not overnight, not easily, but something inside me was growing alongside him. And Rose? She was the anchor in the storm. She rocked him to sleep when my arms gave out. She hummed old gospel songs while folding his onesies. She told me over and over, "You're doing better than you think." And slowly, I started to believe her. Miles turned one in that house. He smashed banana cake all over his cheeks and tried to feed it to the dog. We took a photo, Grandma in her Sunday sweater, me with frosting in my hair, Miles grinning like he'd invented joy. That picture sits on my nightstand now, because those first few years weren't just about raising a child. They were about raising me, too. Some questions come out of nowhere, but once they land, they echo. Miles was 5, sprawled across the porch steps one sticky summer evening, orange popsicle dripping down his fingers and onto his shorts. The sun hung low, casting everything in gold. Marigolds bloomed wild along the fence, and Grandma Rose sat behind him in her rocker, knitting something blue and lumpy that she insisted would be a scarf. The crickets had just started their nightly hum when he asked it, soft but certain, like he'd been saving it up. "Grandma," he said, licking the last of his popsicle. "Why don't I have other grandparents, like the kids at school?" I stiffened from the kitchen window, hands wrist-deep in soapy water, a pot halfway scrubbed. My breath caught. My heart dropped. Out on the porch, Grandma didn't miss a beat. She set her yarn aside, folded her hands gently in her lap, and said, "That's a big question, little man." Miles turned to her, popsicle stick clenched like a baton. "Mom says you're my great-grandma, so where's my regular ones?" Rose let out a soft sigh. Not tired, just prepared. "Well," she said, "sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, big ones, and sometimes they let fear or pride get in the way of love." Miles furrowed his brow, lips stained orange. "They didn't want me?" I stepped outside before Rose could respond, dish towel still clutched in my hand. "That's not true," I said, crouching beside him. "You were always wanted." "But they don't visit," he said quietly. "They don't send me birthday cards. Not even on Christmas." His words sliced deeper than he knew. I glanced at Rose, and she gave me a gentle nod. "Go on. Tell him something true but kind." "They didn't know how to be the kind of family we needed," I said slowly. "When I found out I was going to have you, they got scared, and they said hurtful things. So we decided it was better to build a family that would show up." Miles looked between us. "Like you two?" "Exactly," Rose said, smiling. "Me and your mama? We stuck around. We cheered your first steps. We cleaned up your spaghetti disasters. We love you through and through." Miles was quiet for a beat. Then he whispered, "I like it better with you anyway." Tears burned behind my eyes. I pulled him into a hug, sticky fingers and all. "You'll always have us," I whispered into his hair. "Always." And in that moment, with the evening breeze brushing past, the porch creaking beneath our weight, I realized something. I didn't need to rewrite the past for my son. I just had to give him a better present. Sometimes, the most unexpected heartbreak comes from the softest voices. The sink was warm beneath my hands. I was scrubbing a pot that didn't need scrubbing, just watching the soapy bubbles catch the golden evening light as it spilled through the kitchen window. Outside, I could hear the creak of Grandma Rose's porch rocker, the hum of crickets rising with the dusk, and Miles's little voice dancing through the open air like wind chimes. I wasn't listening too closely until I heard him ask, "Why didn't my other grandparents want me?" Everything in me stilled. The sponge slipped from my fingers with a wet plop. The faucet kept running, but I didn't hear it. I only heard that question, the one I hadn't ever imagined he'd ask out loud. I stayed frozen, one hand gripping the edge of the counter, my breath caught between inhale and collapse. Rose answered gently, just like I knew she would. I couldn't make out the words, just the tone. Steady, loving, brave. Her voice moved through the air like a blanket being laid over something shivering, but I could hear his, clear and piercing. So they didn't love my mom either? That did it. Tears sprang to my eyes so fast I didn't have time to blink them back. I leaned over the sink, pressing a hand to my mouth, trying not to make a sound. It had been 5 years. 5 years since my parents slammed the door and never looked back. 5 years of diapers and teething and midnight rocking. 5 years of first steps, first words, first colds, first birthdays. And not once had they asked to be part of it. And now he was carrying the weight of that rejection too? It wasn't fair. He didn't deserve to wonder why he wasn't enough. Why I wasn't enough. I swiped angrily at my face, then again, when it didn't stop. Soap stung my eyes, or maybe that was just the shame. I thought I'd buried all of this, thought I'd let it go. But hearing it from his mouth, so small, so honest, ripped something open I hadn't even realized was still stitched shut. A moment later, he padded in barefoot, sticky popsicle fingers still clutching the wooden stick like a trophy. "Mom," he said softly, "your eyes are all wet." I turned to him, forcing a smile that didn't quite land. "I got soap in my eyes," I lied. "It stings sometimes." He nodded solemnly, like he understood something bigger than soap. Then he hopped up onto a stool and said, "Grandma's scarf is funny looking." I laughed. Really laughed. The kind that cracked through the weight in my chest. "Yeah," I said, rinsing the pot for the 3rd time. "It definitely has character." And just like that, he moved on, talking about beetles and stars and a lizard he saw at recess. And I let him. Because in that moment, he didn't need my pain. He just needed me. There's a moment in every parent's life when you realize your child sees the world a little differently. And maybe, just maybe, sees more than you ever could. It started at the local library's annual science fair. Miles had begged me for weeks to let him join, even though he was barely 6, and the contest was for kids aged 8 to 12. "Please, Mom," he pleaded one evening, lips sticky from grape juice. "I have an idea. It's about shadows and memory." I blinked. "What kind of idea?" He just grinned, eyes shining. "It's a surprise." So I let him try. That Saturday morning, while most kids showed off vinegar volcanoes or solar systems made of foam balls, Miles stood beside a cardboard trifold titled Echoes of Light. His display? A shoebox with a cutout, a small flashlight, and a lined journal filled with sketches of shadows he'd traced at different times of the day. "It's how light remembers," he told one of the judges, "like the way my mom remembers things, even if they're sad. The light comes back." I froze. He didn't even look at me, just kept tracing this beam with his small fingers, explaining how shadows stretch and return, how they hide but never disappear, how you could see time move if you watched long enough. The room went silent. The judge, a retired physics teacher, crouched beside him, genuinely listening. No condescension, no chuckles, just awe. Afterward, as we packed up, a woman approached. She introduced herself as a local elementary counselor and gently asked, "How old did you say he was?" 6, I replied. She smiled, soft and knowing. "He's not just bright. He's emotionally intuitive. That's rare. You're raising something special here." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, throat tight. As we walked to the car, Miles skipped ahead, holding his shoebox like a trophy. Halfway down the sidewalk, he turned and asked, "Did I do good?" I swallowed the lump in my throat and laughed. "You did amazing, baby. You made them feel something. That's the best kind of smart." He beamed, then added, "I think I got that from you." And that, right there, that melted me. Not the ribbon he didn't win, not the praise from strangers, but the way he connected light and memory, the way he made meaning out of shadows. That night I watched him fall asleep surrounded by his scribbles and shoebox, and I whispered to myself, "You are going to light up this world, kid, even if they don't see you coming." It was one of those Saturdays in early spring when the air still bites, but the sun's trying its best to be kind. Miles and I had just finished his art class at the community center, and he was tugging my hand toward the park across the street, chasing after the promise of a half-melted snowbank. That's when I saw him. He was crouched near a park bench, wearing a navy utility jacket and thick canvas gloves, carefully repairing a wooden birdhouse that had cracked in the wind. He looked up as Miles ran past him, then smiled, an easy, worn-in kind of smile, like he'd known laughter and grief in equal measure. "Yours?" he asked, nodding toward the blur of green jacket and wild curls darting past. I glanced at Miles. "Yeah, all mine." "He's got good energy," the man said, standing slowly, "like someone who makes the air move when he walks." I laughed before I meant to. "He definitely does that." He extended a hand, rough and calloused. "Jack." I shook it. "Tessa." We stood awkwardly for a beat, the breeze catching my coat. I told myself not to linger. I had groceries in the car, emails to return, a stack of bills on the kitchen table. And yet... "Is that birdhouse yours?" I asked, more curious than I should have been. He nodded. "Been coming here since my wife passed. Fixing things. Helps keep the edges soft." Something about the way he said that, soft, not sharp, landed hard in my chest. "Sorry," I said quietly. He shrugged. "Life doesn't ask permission. It just hands you a box and walks away." I knew that box. I'd opened it too many times. Miles returned then, cheeks pink, dragging a soggy paper airplane he insisted was a hawk. "Mom, look, it flew for like 5 seconds. Jack crouched beside him. 5 seconds is a long time in the sky. Miles blinked. "You think so?" "I know so." That night, while tucking Miles in, he whispered, "That man talked to me like I was real." "You are real," I smiled. "Yeah, but grown-ups don't always see it." I kissed his forehead, but my mind was still outside, where a stranger had spoken with more kindness in 10 minutes than most had offered me in 10 years. Some people crash into your life. Others arrive gently, through small moments, shared silences, and broken birdhouses. Meeting Jack didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like breathing again. Jack's idea had been innocent enough. "Let's take Miles to Betty's Diner this Saturday. Their pancakes are the size of hubcaps. He'll love it." I hesitated. That place was practically a town landmark, sure, but also a time capsule, stuffed with locals who remembered me as the girl who got pregnant in high school. Still, Jack was patient. Miles was excited. And honestly, I was tired of letting old ghosts dictate my weekends. We arrived just after 10. The vinyl booths gleamed with fresh polish. The air smelled like bacon and syrup, and Miles was already bouncing on the seat beside me. But I felt it the moment we walked in. Eyes. Not many, but enough. A couple from church. An old classmate who used to whisper behind her coffee cup. I tried to shake it off, focused on Miles and his blueberry-covered grin. Jack sat across from me, unfolding his napkin slowly, sensing the tension I tried so hard to mask. But then I heard it, from 2 booths behind us. "She's back, with a man this time. Wonder if he knows." It wasn't even whispered. Jack looked up. "Tessa?" I clenched my fork. "It's nothing." He set his coffee down carefully. "No, it's not. I heard it too." "I said it's nothing." My voice came out sharper than I meant, slicing the air between us. Miles froze mid-bite. Jack leaned in, his tone low but steady. "We don't have to stay, but you don't have to carry this alone either." The tears stung before I could blink them away. "I've worked for everything, Jack. Every dollar, every bit of respect. And it's still not enough in this town." He reached across the table, gently covering my hand with his. "For them? Maybe not. But for me, and for that boy next to you, it's more than enough." Miles slid out of the booth and came to my side, climbing onto my lap without asking. He rested his head against my shoulder and said softly, "Mom, can we go home?" I nodded. We left the pancakes half-eaten, left the gossip behind, and as we stepped out into the morning chill, I realized What hurt most wasn't their judgment. It was the part of me that still believed them. Some ghosts don't haunt houses. They haunt diners. But that day, I learned something stronger than fear. Love that shows up even when you flinch. It was just meatloaf. Nothing fancy, no linen napkins, no centerpiece. Just a battered baking tray, a bowl of mashed potatoes, and a salad I forgot to dress until the last second. But to me, it felt like Christmas. Jack had offered to cook, but I insisted. "Let me do this," I told him. "I want it to be mine." Miles was sitting at the counter, coloring while humming some tune from school. Jack stood by the fridge, setting out glasses. Everything looked normal, strangely normal, and that scared me. I'd spent so long in survival mode, scraping meals together, teaching Miles how to stretch toothpaste tubes, waiting tables with blistered feet. That peace felt suspicious, like a bubble waiting to pop. But I shook off the nerves and called, "All right, boys, dinner's ready." We gathered at the table. Jack sat to my right, Miles across from me, his chin barely above the plate. The first few bites passed in silence, the clink of forks on ceramic echoing like a melody we hadn't learned the words to yet. Then Miles piped up, "Jack, did you ever eat meatloaf growing up?" Jack chuckled. "Sure did, but it never had this much garlic in it." I blushed. "Too much?" "Just enough to keep vampires away," he winked. Miles laughed so hard he almost spilled his milk. That's when I felt it. A shift. The stiffness in my spine began to ease. My shoulders dropped. My heart, which had been holding its breath for what felt like years, slowly exhaled. After we cleared the plates, Jack offered to wash up, and I didn't argue. I watched him at the sink, sleeves rolled up, humming off key while Miles dried, and I stood there in the doorway, just watching, not planning, not worrying, just being. When Jack finished, he turned and caught me staring. "What?" "Nothing," I whispered. "I just never thought I'd get this." He walked over, brushed a crumb off my cheek, and said softly, "You deserve every bit of it, Tessa." That night, after Miles was tucked in, Jack and I sat on the couch with mugs of peppermint tea. The house was quiet except for the soft buzz of the heater and the ticking of the old wall clock. "I know it's just dinner," I said, but it felt like the start of something. Jack looked at me, his eyes steady. "It is the start of something, and I'm not going anywhere." Sometimes healing doesn't come in grand gestures. It comes in garlic meatloaf and laughter over spilled milk. It was one of those sleepy Sunday mornings where the world outside moved slow and the light slanted through the windows like a warm sigh. Jack was at the kitchen table helping Miles build a castle out of cereal boxes and tape. The boy was in full engineer mode, eyebrows furrowed, tongue sticking out as he focused. Jack listened to every idea like it was a TED Talk, and I stood at the sink, rinsing coffee mugs, heart full and aching all at once, because this wasn't supposed to happen. Not this easily. Not this gently. After what I'd been through, after being pushed out at 17, pregnant, ashamed, alone, I'd built walls that even sunlight struggled to get through. But then came Jack. And suddenly I was laughing again, sleeping more than 4 hours a night, thinking about tomorrow without dread. He didn't press or pry. He just stayed, quietly, constantly, like gravity. That afternoon, after Miles had gone outside to test his cardboard drawbridge, I found Jack on the back steps, sipping iced tea, gaze soft on the horizon. I sat beside him. For a while we didn't speak. The air was heavy with unspoken things. Then I asked, "Why are you really still here?" He looked at me, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you didn't sign up for all this. A single mom, a kid with questions, a woman still figuring herself out." Jack set his glass down, turned toward me fully. "Tessa, I didn't come here looking for simple. I came because I saw something real in you, and I stayed because you make this place feel like home." I swallowed hard. My throat burned, not from tears, but from hope. "That scares me," I whispered. "I know," he said gently, "but not everything good has to come with pain." Silence settled between us again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with something unnameable but undeniably warm. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "You're allowed to be happy, Tessa. You don't need to earn it through suffering." I leaned into his hand for just a second, then pulled away, not because I didn't want more, but because I did. Too much. He didn't push, just smiled. "Whenever you're ready." That night, I lay in bed with the image of his eyes burned into my thoughts. Calm, steady, unafraid of my cracks. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't dream of escape. I dreamt of staying. Sometimes love doesn't crash in, it tiptoes. And if you listen closely, you can hear it humming between the quiet. I'd met enough judgmental stares in my life to know when one was brewing. And walking into Jack's parents' house felt like standing at the edge of a frozen lake, praying it wouldn't crack beneath my feet. His mother, Darlene, greeted me with a polite but cautious smile. Her lipstick didn't move when she spoke. His father, Roger, nodded stiffly and extended a hand, firm and cold like he was sealing a business deal. Their home was all neutral tones, not a speck of dust, and not an inch of warmth out of place. Jack, ever steady, gently placed his hand on the small of my back as he introduced us. "Mom, Dad, this is Tessa, and this little guy here is Miles." Miles clung to my leg, half hidden, eyes wide as he scanned the strange living room. I knelt beside him and whispered, "It's okay, bud. Just say hi." He gave a tiny wave. Darlene's expression softened. Just a little. We sat around the dining table, which looked like it had never hosted anything more chaotic than a linen napkin. Jack reached for the breadbasket, launching into stories from his childhood, soccer mishaps, science fair disasters, his disastrous high school haircut. I joined in where I could, but every word felt weighed down by invisible threads. What do they think of me? Of Miles? Of Jack loving someone like me? Darlene finally turned to me after Jack had excused himself to take a call. "Tessa," she said, her voice smooth but pointed, "Jack tells us you've been through quite a bit." I met her eyes. "That's true." I imagine raising a child on your own hasn't been easy. It wasn't. But I had help from someone who believed in me, my grandmother. And now Jack. There was a flicker in her expression, respect or surprise, maybe both. Roger nodded slightly. Miles, meanwhile, was busy lining up the salt and pepper shakers like chess pieces. Darlene watched him, then turned back to me. "He's a bright boy," I smiled. "He is. He remembers everything. Yesterday he asked me what a mortgage is." A small laugh slipped out of her. Not forced, genuine. When Jack returned, he slipped effortlessly back into the conversation, sensing the tension had eased. Later, as we were leaving, Darlene handed me a small paper bag. "Homemade lemon squares," she said. "Jack loves them." That night, in the car, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. "You okay?" Jack asked, glancing at me. I nodded slowly. "I think they're trying. That's more than I expected." He smiled, reaching for my hand. "They'll come around. Just give them time." And for the first time in years, I felt like the door to a family hadn't just closed in my face, but maybe, just maybe, cracked open. The lake was glass that evening, still, reflecting the fading gold of the sky like it didn't want the day to end. Miles had gone to bed early, worn out from an afternoon of racing paper boats down the creek with Jack. I stepped outside to the porch, mug in hand, just in time to see Jack kneeling beside a lantern. For a moment, I thought he was tying his shoe. Then he looked up and held out a small velvet box. I froze. "This wasn't how I planned it," he said, nervous smile tugging at his lips. I had a speech. There were candles involved, maybe music. But then I watched you tonight, helping Miles with his drawings, laughing like you weren't carrying the weight of 1,000 yesterdays. And I thought, why wait? My heart thudded so hard I could barely breathe. He opened the box. A simple, delicate ring. Nothing flashy, but it was us. Real, honest. "Tessa Rayner," he said. "Will you marry me? Not because I want to rescue you, not because I think you need fixing, but because you're already the strongest woman I know, and I want to build a life with someone like that." Tears welled up before I could stop them. You mean it? I whispered. Every word. I nodded, choking on relief, love, disbelief. Yes, yes, Jack. He stood and wrapped me in the kind of hug that makes time slow down. But the surprises weren't over. The next morning, while clearing the breakfast table, I found a thick envelope sitting by my coffee cup. My name was written in elegant handwriting. Miles grinned like he was in on a secret. Jack shrugged innocently. Might want to open that? Inside was a scholarship award, fully funded. Culinary Arts, Vermont School of Artisan Food. I blinked, mouth open. I never applied. How? Jack rubbed the back of his neck. You mentioned it once. I made a few calls, sent over some of your recipes and photos. Turns out you impressed the right people. I just stared at him. Jack, this is a dream I buried years ago. He reached across the table and took my hand. Then let's dig it back up. I laughed through tears. I don't know what I did to deserve you. He smiled. You let me love you. That's more than enough. Miles piped up. Does this mean we're all moving to Vermont? We both burst out laughing. Later that night, as I watched my boys, one small, one grown, build yet another cardboard contraption in the living room, I realized something. It wasn't about finally having a perfect life. It was about finally believing I was allowed one. Returning to Ohio after all those years felt like walking back into a house where the furniture was familiar, but the walls remembered every argument. I hadn't been home since Miles was born, not for holidays, not for birthdays, not even for Grandma's funeral. But now, with Jack's ring on my finger and a scholarship letter tucked in my purse, I felt like I could finally face the ghosts. We arrived just after noon. Jack parked a block away, sensing I needed those final few steps on my own. The fall air carried the scent of dry leaves and old memories. I knocked. My mother answered. She looked older, thinner. The same eyes, but dimmer somehow. Tessa, she breathed. Her voice cracked on the edges. I didn't think you'd ever. I nodded. I wasn't sure either. She stepped aside. Come in? I walked in, slowly. Every creak in the floorboard brought back the night they kicked me out, the night they chose shame over love. Jack and Miles waited outside. This part I needed to do alone. We sat in the living room. She offered coffee. I declined. Small talk sputtered and died. I heard about the scholarship, she finally said, and the engagement. I wasn't expecting congratulations, I replied, not harshly, just truthfully. She folded her hands. I was wrong back then. So wrong. I was scared. And I took it out on you. Silence stretched between us. She looked down at her hands. I don't expect forgiveness, she said quietly. But I need you to know, I think about that night every day. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Miles asked about you last year, about why he doesn't have grandparents like other kids. Her face crumpled. Can I meet him? I paused, looked out the window. Jack and Miles were tossing a football on the lawn, laughing, free. And suddenly, I saw it for what it was. Not a trap, not a guilt offering, but a choice. My choice. I turned back to her. Yes. She blinked. What? You can meet him, but not as a way to erase the past. Only if you're willing to show up, consistently, and let him decide how close he wants you. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded. Yes, absolutely. Anything. We stood. She hesitated, then reached for a hug. I let her. Outside, I waved at Jack and Miles. They came jogging up. My mother wiped her face quickly. Miles tilted his head. Mom? I bent down. Miles, this is your grandma. He looked at her. She looked at him. Then, without a word, he offered her a fist bump. She smiled like it was a miracle, and maybe it was. The hospital hallway smelled of hand sanitizer and fresh paint. My heels clicked softly on the polished floor as I followed the nurse down the corridor. There was a strange mix of nerves in my chest, part pride, part disbelief. Dr. Miles Rayner? The nurse called, peeking into one of the rooms. A tall young man emerged, stethoscope around his neck, clipboard in hand. His dark blue scrubs looked like they were tailored to fit, though I knew he'd never care about that. His hair was a little messy, his eyes tired, but when he saw me, a smile broke across his face that still looked like the boy I once held in my arms, whispering lullabies through sleepless nights. Mom. Hearing him say it in that deep, confident voice never stopped hitting me in the gut. I held out my arms. He didn't hesitate. He hugged me like he meant it, like every moment we'd scraped through had shaped this exact embrace. I still can't believe they put doctor in front of your name, I teased, stepping back and pretending to squint at his name badge. I still can't believe you didn't pass out at my white coat ceremony, he shot back. I laughed, but my eyes misted. Only because I cried all morning beforehand. He chuckled and motioned for me to follow him into the small break room. He poured me a coffee from a nearly empty pot and handed it over with both hands, just like I used to do with his cocoa on snowy mornings. As we sat, the silence between us felt easy, earned. Jack wanted to come, but he's helping set up the rehearsal dinner, I said. Tell him thanks for letting me steal you for a bit. He didn't have a choice. I told him this was non-negotiable. I smiled, then paused, voice softening. I needed to see you here, in your world, where all that struggle led. Miles leaned back, rubbing the back of his neck, a nervous tic he still hadn't outgrown. I think about those nights in Grandma Elena's kitchen a lot, studying while you made dinner, the Post-its you'd stick on my books. You've got this. Make me proud, Dr. Miles. I swallowed hard. You did. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled old Post-it, the ink faded but legible. Whatever they said about you, they were wrong. You're meant for great things. I kept this, he said. When I didn't believe it, you did. The tears I'd been holding finally slid down. You saved me, Mom, he whispered. I shook my head. No, baby. You saved both of us. He stood, and so did I. Another long hug, tighter this time. When we broke apart, his pager buzzed. Go, I said, brushing his shoulder. Your patients need their miracle worker. He grinned. You coming to the dinner? Wouldn't miss it for the world. As I watched him walk away down the hallway, confident, kind, whole, I realized something. This wasn't just a happy ending. It was a beginning he built from the ruins, and I got to be his first foundation. I first noticed him outside the flower shop. I had just picked up a bouquet for Jack's mom, sunflowers, her favorite, and was walking back to my car when I felt it. That prickly sensation on the back of your neck, like someone's watching. I turned. A man across the street ducked his head and pretended to be on his phone. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then I saw him again, at the bakery near the diner, leaning against a lamppost. 2 days later, he passed slowly by the community center as I walked out after helping with wedding arrangements. Same hat, same long coat, same eerie stillness. I never said anything to Jack, not yet. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe I was overthinking. God knows I'd lived too long being on alert. Trauma doesn't always ask permission before it revisits you. But on the morning I picked up my wedding dress, after months of savings, of stitching dreams into white fabric, I caught sight of him again, reflected in the boutique's front mirror. This time he didn't look away. I froze, gripping the hanger tighter, heart knocking against my ribs. My voice barely found itself. Excuse me, I said to the seamstress. I need a minute. Out in the parking lot, I took a breath and walked straight toward him. Can I help you? I asked, steady but sharp. He blinked. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. Then stop following me. He held up both hands. Tessa Rayner, right? Every muscle in my body locked up. You don't know me, he continued, but I knew your father. My father. A name I hadn't spoken in years. A man who chose silence over me the night I was thrown out at 17. I'm not here to hurt you, he said quickly. I was asked to find you. Before he died, your father left something, a letter. I stared at him, half expecting the ground to open beneath me. He regretted what happened, the man added. All of it. He wanted to make things right. My first instinct was to laugh. Right? Now? Instead, I asked, why now? Because, he said gently, pulling a sealed envelope from his jacket. He didn't know how to reach you until recently. He hired me through a law firm in Tallahassee. I finally traced you here through hospital records, your name on Miles' residency program. He handed me the envelope like it might dissolve between us. I didn't take it. Leave it at the diner, I said, with Jack, and don't follow me again. I turned and walked away without another word. That night, I didn't sleep. The envelope sat on the kitchen counter like a ghost. And in the dark, I wondered, not for the first time, if some hauntings don't come from outside, but from the people we once begged to love us. The diner was quiet for once, early morning light casting soft shadows across the linoleum floor, the scent of fresh biscuits still hanging in the air. I had come in before opening, hoping for a few moments of peace. The envelope the man left for Jack sat untouched on the counter, mocking me with its perfect edges and the name scrawled across the front. Tessa Marie Rayner. I didn't have the stomach to read it. Jack walked in behind me, coffee thermos in hand, his voice gentle. You don't have to open it, Tess. Not until you're ready. I'm not sure I ever will be, I admitted. But fate doesn't always wait for permission. The bell above the door jingled. I turned, expecting one of the usuals, maybe old Carl needing his 7 a.m. grits. Instead, the air shifted. A woman stood just inside the threshold, mid-60s. Her coat hung too loose on her shoulders. Her eyes, blue like mine, scanned the diner slowly, landing on me with a mixture of hope and fear. Tessa? She asked. I blinked. Yes? She took a step forward. Her voice faltered. My name's Marlene Rayner. I'm your grandmother. The world tilted. I didn't speak. Couldn't. My grandmother? My father's mother? The woman I thought had died years ago? I only found out recently, she continued quickly, about everything, about what happened, about you. Jack moved instinctively beside me, his hand brushing mine under the counter, grounding me. I didn't know they kicked you out, she said, voice cracking. If I had, I swear to you I would have come. I searched her face for any sign of a lie, but all I saw was grief, deep, aging, honest grief. You weren't at the funeral, I said, my voice surprisingly even. I wasn't invited. I hadn't spoken to my son in over a decade. She smiled faintly, painfully. He didn't like the way I talked back. That sounded familiar. She took something from her bag, a small photo, creased at the edges. A girl on a swing, maybe 5 years old. Me. I kept this, she said. All these years. I prayed I'd see you again. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. Why now? I whispered. Because when people finally tell the truth, she said softly, it opens doors, even the ones we thought were locked forever. I reached out and took the photo. My fingers brushed hers. Cool, fragile, real. For the first time in years, I felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. It was nearly sunset when I drove up the gravel path to Grandma Elena's cabin. The pines swayed gently, whispering the kind of quiet only she could ever make feel safe. I hadn't called ahead. I didn't have the words, just that photo in my coat pocket and the echo of Marlene's voice still bouncing inside my chest. When I stepped onto the porch, the front door was already open, just a sliver. A soft light spilled out, the smell of baked apples drifting through the gap like a memory. Elena? I called, pushing the door a little wider. She was at the kitchen table, knitting needles in hand, though the yarn had stopped mid-stitch. Her eyes met mine like she already knew something had changed. You saw her, she said calmly, like it was a weather report. I nodded, closing the door behind me but not sitting down yet. Yeah, she came to the diner this morning, said she's my grandmother. She is, Elena said, setting the needles down. Your dad pushed her out years ago. Too opinionated for his taste. Why didn't you ever tell me? Her shoulders sank, the weight of years catching up in a single breath. Because I didn't want you tangled in that old bitterness, and maybe part of me thought if she cared, she'd find you sooner. She had a photo of me, Elena, I whispered. A swing in the backyard. I must have been 5. Elena looked down at her hands. That was my photo. She asked for it before she left town. I didn't think she kept it. That hit something inside me. A knot I'd carried for years started to loosen. She said she didn't know what happened, I added. Didn't know they kicked me out. That she would have helped. And do you believe her? Elena's voice was soft but steady. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I sat across from her and pulled the photo from my pocket, sliding it onto the table between us. I don't know, I said honestly, but when she looked at me, it wasn't pity. It was regret, and maybe something like love, the kind that didn't get a chance. We sat in silence a while, the air thick with memories that hadn't yet been shared. Finally, Elena leaned over and placed her hand over mine. People make mistakes, Tess, big ones. But sometimes the door they shut too fast stays open just enough for grace to slip in. I squeezed her hand. I don't know if I'm ready to open it all the way. You don't have to, she said, but it's okay to stand in the doorway and see what's on the other side. Outside, the light was fading, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was in the dark. 3 days after the door was left ajar, she walked through it. Rose didn't call, didn't write, just knocked on the front door of the cabin like she'd lived there her whole life. I opened it expecting the UPS guy, or maybe a neighbor returning one of Grandma Elena's pie tins. Instead, I found a woman holding a tin of lemon bars, a bundle of nerves, and a vintage cardigan. You don't like chocolate, she said softly. Your mom told me once. I stood there, unsure whether to laugh or cry. She looked older than I remembered, her hair silvering at the temples, her voice slightly husky, like someone who'd swallowed 100 apologies and never let them out. You want to come in? I asked, finally stepping aside. The living room was quiet. Elena had gone out to visit a friend in town, leaving us alone, as if she knew this needed to happen without witnesses. We sat across from each other, the tin unopened between us. Rose exhaled. I didn't come to plead my case. Good, I said, sharper than I meant. She nodded, taking it in. I came to ask for judgment. That stopped me. I didn't look for you after your parents kicked you out. I didn't ask questions. I was too wrapped up in pride. Angry at your dad, yes, but also ashamed I'd let the years pile up between us. My chest tightened. You weren't the only one who let them pile up. I know, she said, looking straight into my eyes, but I'm the adult who should have known better. For a moment, we just sat in it, the ache, the shared failures, the ache of time you can't get back. I'm not a child anymore, Rose, I said. I have a son. I've built a life. I don't need saving. I'm not here to save you, she said. I'm here hoping to earn a seat in that life, even if it's just on the porch. Tears rose fast, unexpected. I turned away, embarrassed, but her voice followed gently. I brought a photo album, she said. It's in the car. You might not care, but it's full of every letter I wrote and never sent, every Christmas card I signed and stuffed in a drawer because I didn't think I had the right. You could have tried, I whispered. I didn't know how, she replied. I still don't. But I'm here. And I will keep showing up, even if you tell me to go. My hand hovered over the tin of lemon bars. I opened it, took one out, and handed it to her. This doesn't mean everything's fine. I wouldn't believe it if it did. But she smiled, a tired, hopeful curve of the mouth that felt like spring after a long winter. I didn't forgive her yet, but for the first time, I wanted to try. The day we said I do, the sky was overcast, but I didn't mind. I'd learned by now that the most beautiful moments rarely arrive with perfect weather. We didn't rent a ballroom or hire a photographer with a drone, just a white tent in Grandma Elena's backyard, twinkling lights strung between apple trees, and folding chairs borrowed from the church 2 blocks down. Jack stood at the front with a crooked tie and the softest eyes I'd ever seen. Secret clutched a tiny velvet pillow like it held the entire world. My hands trembled as I reached for Jack's, not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of how far I'd come to get here. From sleeping in the back of a station wagon, to raising a child in the shadow of shame, to finally choosing myself, then finding someone who chose me, too. I caught Rose in the crowd, standing near the back. She wasn't dressed like a mother of the bride, no corsage, no spotlight. But she clutched the same photo album she'd brought weeks ago, worn and cracked at the corners. She'd stayed on the porch every visit since, never once pushing for more than I was ready to give. And for that, she'd earned her place. I said my vows with tears in my eyes but a steady voice. Because for once, I wasn't promising to be perfect. I was promising to be honest, to be present, and to never again abandon myself in the name of love. After the cake had been cut and the music faded into firefly silence, I found a moment alone with Grandma Elena in the kitchen. She was drying dishes, humming off-key to an old Patsy Cline tune. "Not bad for a girl who got kicked out with nothing but a baby and a backpack, huh?" I teased. She turned, eyes misty. "Not bad for a woman who rebuilt her own foundation. Brick by brick," I smiled, pressing my forehead to hers. "Thank you for never giving up on me." "Oh, honey," she whispered, "I never doubted you'd bloom. I just made sure you had soil to stand in." Outside, Secret was chasing bubbles with Jack's nieces, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was surviving. I felt like I was home. We talk a lot about cutting ties, but sometimes the real courage is in choosing which ones to mend, with thread made from forgiveness, boundaries, and love on your terms. Not every scar needs to be erased. Some just need room to breathe, and healing? It doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it looks like a backyard wedding, a hesitant mother's embrace, or a child laughing under string lights. So if you've ever felt broken beyond repair, look again. You're not broken. You're just in the middle of becoming. If Tessa's story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe for more powerful journeys like this, and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below.